Hello, everyone. Okay. So this is part 3 of the Andrew Jackson, Good, Evil, and the Presidency PBS documentary. We already, I did the first 2 weeks ago. So I'd love to just catch up. But it's 30 minutes, so you should know by now. So we're going to go ahead and start this. This is another 15 minutes, and then, boom, done.
Old Hickory had never had a day of formal military training in his life. And yet the Battle of New Orleans would be depicted in song, story, and art for the next 100 years. For Andrew Jackson and his men were about to shock the world. To even out the odds with the British, Jackson enlisted the aid of the French pirate Jean Lafitte, Choctaw Indians, and the free blacks of New Orleans. Then he massed them beside his men on a narrow stretch of ground between a swamp and the Mississippi River. On January 8, 1815, a huge wave of battle-hardened British troops swept down on Jackson's irregulars. Instead of turning and running, as the British had watched American troops do in numerous battles before, Jackson and his men marched into the pages of American history.
They really thought that once these professionals...
I don't know how to say his name. Robert Remini. I've said it before, but I have several books about Andrew Jackson by him, and he's passed now, but he was such a great writer, and clearly he knew a lot about Jackson, but he's a great writer. There are some books out there by him, and one of them that I have is like 3 books, all in one. Well, it's 3 separate books, but it's one, his life. And then there's an abridged one, so it's much shorter, so you can probably speed read that if you want, but I recommend it if you have any interest in it. He writes really well. H.W. Brands has a good one. I think I talked about this in the previous videos. American Lion by John Meacham is good. That focuses more on Jackson and kind of the bonds of the people that were around him, and not necessarily just him. H.W. Brands is pretty much all about him, and anything that he writes is pretty much always about him. And he doesn't pull, what I like is he doesn't pull punches. He doesn't try to, soothe over things that aren't good. He and I think that's good. He doesn't try to make it seem like it's okay, even though back then it was, but he so anyways,
came marching towards these frontiersmen. They'd all run, and to their surprise, they not only didn't run, they stood and fired one volley after another right into the faces of these poor oncoming British soldiers. And
the British also were fighting like they'd normally fight. They'd get in their columns and march. Jackson, I believe, was on top of a hill, and the people had to come up, or it was some sort of ground, and he had it pretty much just all set up and defended and blocked off. So his guys were basically hiding. Not hiding, but, like we would fight today. Fire a shot, hide behind some logs or something like that. That's not what the British were doing. The British were fighting like gentlemen, and we were fighting to live. So it was a much different battle scenario. And it should also be said that this happened 2 weeks after the Treaty of Ghent. So the war officially was over. No one knew it, though, because back in those days it took, what, was it a month or 6 weeks for letters to go over? In fact, the war shouldn't have even happened. The War of 1812 shouldn't have even happened. America told British, listen, stop impressing us and stop doing this, stop doing that. And they were going to blockade, or not blockade, they were going to have an embargo against the British and the French, which they did. The British started realizing this is hurting their pocketbooks because they needed raw materials from the U.S. And England sat down and said, okay, we will stop the harassment of the Americans. But in that time, over in the U.S., James Madison doesn't know what they're doing. So a declaration from Congress, and he goes to him and basically just declares war. So by the time the declaration of war reaches Britain, they've sent a thing over to America. There's no going back. England takes it as oh, okay, you want to go to war? We'll go to war. And the U.S. takes it as, oh, well, damn it. Had we known that they were going to be cool about this, we wouldn't have declared war. No one could go back on it, though. The Americans couldn't go back and say, well, hold on, because then they'd look weak. The British can't say, well, they declared war on us. Let's just smooth it out, because then they would have looked weak. So it's just a bad position for both sides. I apologize for all the talking.
Just mowed them down.
Jackson had proved that America could stand up to the world's greatest military power and win.
The victory that he won was almost unbelievable. The British lost hundreds of men dead on the battlefield. Jackson's casualties in the main battle were 8 killed and 13 wounded. It was astonishing. It's still astonishing.
As news of the victory spread across the country, America was swept up in a wave of patriotism unrivaled in its history.
I think the whole character of the American people changed after the War of 1812. Prior to that time, you asked a person who or what they were, they would say, I'm a New Yorker, I'm a Virginian, I'm from Connecticut, I'm from Massachusetts. After New Orleans, they said, I am an American.
Americans' pride in the victory was stoked by a flood of images of the battle. For a new invention, aquatint engraving enabled artists to make multiple color copies of the same image much faster than ever before. A delighted American public bought up thousands of pictures of the glorious American victory at New Orleans. And at the center of many of these new engravings was the new American hero, Andrew Jackson.
Andrew Jackson was really one of the first national celebrities. Songs were written about him, clubs were founded for him. January 8th, the anniversary of the Battle of New Orleans, towns would have Jackson dinners and banquets. He was a cultural force before he was a political force.
The festivities were boisterous, for Americans had more than just the Battle of New Orleans to celebrate.
After 1815, the Americans were very much free to work out their own destiny without interference from Europe. This meant that they were enthused, excited. They thought they could accomplish anything they wanted to.
Just want to say, the Battle of New Orleans was the last battle that the British and the Americans have ever faced off against one another. That was the last fight. And yeah, the fight technically should not have happened, but I think with just such a death rate difference, I mean, I think that goes a long way back then to look at it like, yeah, it shouldn't have happened, but they killed a lot of our people and they went toe to toe. They didn't care. I think that also helped with the image of the Americans around the world, that there was this leader, in Andrew Jackson. Just guessing.
It also lent a sense of urgency. They believed that if they didn't get it right now, they might not get another chance. That this was the time, this was the place on which a new world was going to be created, they had to make sure that it was the right new world.
This turbulent age would become the only period in American history known by the name of a single man, the Jacksonian era. Yet as the era began, Andrew Jackson was once again living on a farm in Tennessee with no clear future in American politics. For Rachel Jackson, having Andrew home was a break from what was in many ways a lonely life. She and Andrew had proven unable to have children, and her dream of spending her life surrounded by a loving husband and large family had not come true.
I think that when Rachel ran off with Andrew Jackson, she thought that she was going to get a husband who was devoted to her and that they would have this warm circle around the family fire every night with children running about, very similar to the household she had grown up in. But instead, she's married a man who's got tremendous ambition. So instead of having this quiet family home, which I think was at the heart of Rachel's desires, instead she's married to a very ambitious man who pursues national politics, becomes a military leader, and in her own words, spends less than a fourth of his nights under his own roof.
As he waited to see what avenue for his ambition might open next, Andrew Jackson tended to his farm and his horses and became a wealthy man. His admirers were soon touting the political appeal of a penniless orphan who had pulled himself up by his own bootstraps. But the real story of how Andrew Jackson became a wealthy man was more complicated.
Frederick Douglass. General Jackson has to own that he owes his farm on the banks of the Mobile to the strong arm of the Negro.
For millions of poor white Americans, many of whom had come from Europe seeking a better life, the ideal America was one in which they could prosper. To give them that opportunity, General Andrew Jackson had forced the Creek Nation to cede vast amounts of land in what would become Alabama and Mississippi to the United States. The treasured myth was that this was a place where white Americans could improve their lot by relying solely on their own hard labor. The harsh reality was that it was black Americans who were often doing much of the labor. Jackson himself founded a plantation in northern Alabama on land from which he had just driven the creeks. To work the land, he brought in slaves.
Jackson firmly believed that the slaves were put on this earth to labor, and whites are here to rule and to govern and to lead society. And they are at the top of the pecking order, they are at the top of the social order, they are at the top of the political order, and therefore they're the ones who rule.
I think most white people, at least in America, thought that kind of same way. Not all of them owned slaves, mind you. But even the white people who were against slavery didn't want a black person to become free and live near them. Send them back to Africa. And then even as far as the abolitionists who might help a slave run away in the Underground Railroad. They might hug him, feed him, care for him, hide him, but they also didn't want him near him. It was just kind of it was what it was. It's it's not right, but it's just how they lived back then.
superior whites lead, inferior blacks follow.
Jackson named his biggest parcel of land near Nashville the Hermitage. At the height of its operation, well over 100 slaves at the Hermitage called Andrew Jackson master.
He would have been a very paternalistic person, and he would have made the slaves think he was their mother and father and God all wrapped into one. But to enslave another person, another human being, you can't be a good person. You have to be a pretty tough, vicious, mean person to hold another person or 140 people in slavery for all of their lives.
When one of Jackson's slaves escaped, he offered a reward to anyone who would give the man 300 lashes.
300 lashes could kill a man because of the infection from 300 lashes on his back. Perhaps they would put some grease into the wound, some ointment into the wound. They may pour some whiskey on it, and which would make the man go into shock. But he could die from those wounds. He certainly would be ill for a long time. And that would remind all the other slaves, here's what you're going to get if you try to run away from this place.
Though a few white Americans were starting to question the morality of enslaving blacks, the fact was that slavery was vital to American prosperity, and men like Andrew Jackson could not envision a world without it.
Human slavery was the powerhouse of the early American economy. Slave-grown products were the most valuable exports that the United States produced. Slave-grown cotton, slave-grown rice, slave-grown tobacco spilled out of the plantations of the South, crowded onto boats, enriched the harbors of New York and Boston, and then fed an appetite of a hungry and shivering world. And that's where the money came from. So the people who owned the slaves and the people who bought and sold the produce that the slaves made were the richest people in the country. And it was the desire to get more of those riches that drove Americans into the best cotton country in the world, the country that was possessed by the Creek and the Choctaw and the Cherokee and the Chickasaw Indians.
The relentless demand for Indian land on which to grow cotton created intense conflict with Native Americans.
I'm out of frame like this because I have a sick dog, and so she's right next to me, so apologize for that. I might end this, instead of 15 minutes, I might cut it short because she's got to go out.
Some of the bloodiest fighting was in southern Georgia, where white settlers were battling Seminoles and Creeks who were staging cross-border raids from Florida. With Florida still owned by Spain, President James Monroe called up a man he knew he could depend on to defend America's borders. But General Jackson had even bigger plans.
Jackson really wasn't simply concerned with Indian insurgency in Florida. He was really concerned about the growing numbers of free and escaped blacks who were there, free and escaped slaves who were there, who were armed and potentially dangerous and a magnet for other slaves. It's a threat to the plantation economy. The combination of an Indian slave alliance had haunted Americans from the 18th century onward, and this was something that concerned Jackson terribly.
Without orders from Washington, Jackson launched an invasion of Florida and conquered it. During the invasion, he captured 2 British men who he believed were inciting attacks on Americans. Ignoring the ruling of his own military tribunal, he had both men executed.
I'm going to tell a little story and then I'm going to end it. On this, somebody had written a letter. I think it was the British, and it might be said, had written a letter basically demanding that they be released. He responded with a letter, you know, this is the reason why they're not going to be released, and and they will be executed, blah, blah, blah. And then at the very bottom, P.S., they were executed an hour ago. And then it was sent off. He's just a psychopath.
When news of the unauthorized invasion reached Washington, the Speaker of the House, Henry Clay, declared that Jackson had the makings of an American Napoleon.
I'm audiobook right now, a book about Henry Clay. It's pretty interesting. They hated each other.
Called on Congress to censure Jackson. Being censured would have disgraced Jackson, but his conquest of Florida was enormously popular with most Americans, and Congress refused to censure the great war hero.
Henry Clay. I fail to see how the killing of 2,000 English persons in New Orleans qualifies a person for the difficult and complicated duties of the presidency.
I'm going to end it here because my dog has to go out. She's got a bad tummy. So, all right. I'm going to end this here. Then the next one I'll take to the 2 hour mark, or the hour mark. So, stay tuned. I'm thinking it's Monday, Monday, May 22nd. And I'm thinking I might take a trip down to the Hermitage on Saturday. I really want to go more for the Bell Witch Cave, but I might take a trip down because it'll be a holiday weekend. But I might just stay home and do absolutely nothing. You know. So, until part 4, like and subscribe, and have a good day, have a good night.